Good morning and good evening. Welcome everybody to 15-minute Hikha. 15-minute Hikhalor সকলোকে আদৰণি জনাইছো। আজি আমাৰ মাজত আছে Namrata Goswami. Namrata currently is a professor in Arizona State University. He specializes in space policy, international relations, and ethnic identity. She was also a senior fellow at United States Institute of Peace, a Washington, D.C. Fulbright Nehru Senior Fellowship recipient. And Namrata did her college, like undergrad from Cotton College, and did her PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in International Relationship. She authored a lot of books on different varied topics, I would say, and I would like say the name of two books. One is Scramble for the Skies, The Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outspace. It's available in Amazon. And also another book on ethnicity, Indian national security and insurgency, the use of force as a non-violence responses, studies in insurgency and national security. And she also spoke in several very respected and popular media like CNN, BBC, and she is also a TEDx speaker. We are very honored to have Namrata in our platform today. Without further ado, I would like to invite Namrata to speak. And before start, I would like to give a little bit of housekeeping. So we are going to mute everybody during her talk, and once she finishes, you can raise your hand, and we'll unmute you, and we can ask questions. And also you can type your questions in the chat, and one of us will ask. And and we'd like to thank you, Namrata, for joining us, and we'd like to invite you to speak.
Thank you so much. And can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so মোৰ খুব ভাল লাগিছে. First of all, Cotton College memories are very deep, and I think my education there offered me the foundation to where I am today in terms of teaching, research, as well as the kind of work I do. So Sangamitra told me that I have about 30 minutes, so let me share my screen. Can all of you see my screen now? Just Sangamitra, can you see it?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, great.
Sure.
So what I discussed with Sangamitra is to speak about my expertise right now that I'm working on for the last, actually I'm working on international relations and a concept called grand strategy for the last 20 years. But in the last 7 years, I have also looked specifically in terms of space policy, and especially the space policy and programs of two important countries, China and India, in Asia. So why is space suddenly becoming so important in terms of countries' investment? One is that space plays a very important role in terms of identity of a particular country, its political identity, societal, technological development. Space directly contributes to human development. For example, all of us use space for internet, for e-commerce, for ATM transactions, for GPS, for example, when you're using to move from one place to the other. More importantly, when you are trading, so almost all of us depend on import of oil. For example, India is a big depender of oil from the Persian Gulf. The most important contribution of space is to offer navigation to the container ships, also to forecast disasters, and more importantly, weather forecasting. So without that, our entire trading system will not be possible in the modern context. So more importantly, what I have noticed in the last 7 years is that the entire idea of space is becoming, as I said, a lot about economic capability, but also in terms of looking at it from more a permanent presence capability. So till today, since the Cold War, all of us have depended on satellites, which is placed in low Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit. Low Earth orbit starts about 100 kilometers above Earth's surface and goes on to about 36,000 kilometers. From 36,000 kilometers, it's geosynchronous orbit. And so today, instead of just having satellite presence, nations are also thinking about utilizing, for example, resources on the moon. The moon has resources like iron ore, titanium, aluminum. I'll talk a little bit about how India has contributed to that data. And so China, for example, has a very long-term ambition to utilize the resources on the moon. And so instead of just sending humans there for a few days, countries are also talking about establishing permanent settlement, for example, on the moon. More importantly, space also requires long-term planning. It's like pharmaceutical. It takes a long time to develop a particular space technology. And so you need long-term planning, you need long-term funding. Also, you need long-term policy support. Now, importantly, since the end of the Cold War, space has seen the rise of the private sector. So before the Cold War, private entities did not contribute as much to space capability. But today, companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, where Sanghamitra works, is playing a very critical role in terms of developing a reusable rocket that is going to bring down the price of going to space, as well as make space much more democratic. So today, you just have about 600 human beings that have been to space among the billions of us. In the next 10, 15 years, this is all going to change because the access to space is going to become much higher. So I used a concept called grand strategy. And so in my definition, which I've taken from Paul Van Hooft, from the Oxford Compendium on Grand Strategy. Grand strategy is the highest level of national statecraft that establishes how states prioritize and mobilize their military, diplomatic, political, economic, and other sources of power. So it depends on what a particular nation wants as to what it wants from its space program. For example, India wants to develop space from a grand strategic perspective that adds to the country's economic, social, as well as diplomatic capability. China has a very similar strategy. A country like Bhutan might have a very different strategy as to how it views space. African nations, for example, where I teach with the African Space Leadership Network, my students tell me that they view space much more from an economic perspective and not from a grand strategic perspective. So there are differences in how space is viewed. And then strategic culture really plays a very critical role. So it depends on how countries view space. Do they view space as an opportunity or do they view space as a threat? So that also plays into the political culture of a nation. And so when you think about political culture can have the effect of limiting attention to less than the full range of alternate behavior. So depending on your ideological, political inclination, sometimes you might view something as an opportunity, but most of the time nations also see the limits of space capability and space, culture. And that political culture really matters, what kind of culture a nation has, and you can see it across the world. And then I already spoke about strategic culture. And then finally, before I go into the specifics of China and India's space program, my work also focuses on a concept called geopolitics. So geopolitics is a study of how the projection of power, ideological, cultural, economic, or military is affected and in turn is affected by the geographic and political landscape. So it really, really is important to realize that nations behave as per their geographic location. So many people ask me the question as to why India is investing, for example, in a military satellite capability, by which India wants to utilize satellite imaging, satellite reconnaissance to see what is happening in its border areas. The answer is actually quite insightful. It's because India is located in a landscape that has two critical border disputes with China and Pakistan. And historically, human intelligence has sometimes failed to showcase what is happening at the high Himalayas. So satellites can actually offer you very clear images as to where, for example, a Chinese installation is being developed across the line of actual control, or what is happening across the border, for example, with Pakistan, or in Northeast India, how is the border being monitored, for example, with Bangladesh and Myanmar, where some of the problems have come from. So geopolitics really matters. The US, where we live, also does not have the strategic vulnerability that India has. Most Americans don't realize that US does not have nuclear weapon neighbors. So neither Canada nor Mexico has nuclear weapons, whereas India is in a neighborhood where both China and Pakistan has very high level nuclear capability. And that also factors into geopolitiks. Now, one of my colleagues that I work with at Air University, Everett Dolman, his book is called Astropolitics. It's a great book. So Dolman has coined the term astropolitics, where he argues that astropolitics is the study of the relationship between outer space, technology, and terrain, and the development of political and military policy and strategy. So in Dolman's perspective, nations need to develop access to low Earth orbit, starting from 100 kilometers to 36,000 kilometers. Only then can you have access, say, for example, to the moon that goes beyond that, and geosynchronous orbit. Now, there are different schools of space theory. It's very, I find this very insightful. Some nations invest in space because of political reasons. Historically, during the Cold War, both the US and the USSR invested in space because they saw it as ideologically attractive. So which political ideology will be more attractive to nations in the world? Will it be communism that Soviet Union reflected, or will it be democratic capitalism that the United States reflected? So the entire race to the moon, the Apollo program, and John F. Kennedy's famous speech was about that. Nations also view space from an economic perspective. So, for example, if you look at China's space program, they argue that their investment in space is about bringing economic development to China. They're very clear that space is not just about political, but also how countries like China can benefit from space development. Then there is a whole science and technology sector. So this intersects with political and economic. Nations invest in space for science and technology. Space can be utilized to understand Earth, for example, through satellites. And space can also be utilized, for example, to study the origin of the universe. How did the Earth and the moon actually originate billions of years ago? So space will have that kind of data, especially studying the moon and the asteroid hits. And then there are interplanetary schools. So many of the countries investing in space wants to go beyond our solar system to the solar systems like Alpha Centauri, which is so difficult to reach because it's so far away that we can never do it in our lifetime. But we can send robotic probes that can actually survive the radiation of space and go and invest other solar system. NASA has a program, the New Horizon probe, that actually has gone to the farthest reaches of the solar system. And so China and now India wants to have similar probes. Now, space itself is a very interesting concept technologically. So today, when we talk about space, we talk a lot about Earth orbit. The magnetic and the gravitational influence of Earth is low Earth orbit and beyond. But then there are those countries that want to go beyond that, to go to Mars, for example, with deep space missions, and asteroid also in terms of asteroid probes. Now, I teach space policy. So I keep all that in mind in terms of geopolitics, astropolitics, as well as the different schools of space theory. So space policy process is very interesting and I think very important to understand. So I define space policy as a process of developing, prioritizing, and implementing a plan of action developed by the government entity. So space policy is not made by an academic like me. I can explain what a country's space policy is, but I do not make it. It's only government entities, for example, in India, the Department of Space, that builds space policy. In the US, it's the National Space Council in collaboration with NASA and other entities. In China, it is the highest level of the Politburo that makes space policy. So how do nations build space policy? So first of all, you identify a problem. For example, in China, one of the problems they identified in 2014 was the lack of private investment in space. So what they did is that once they identified the problem, the State Council then formulated a policy called Document 60 that prioritized investments in space from the private sector and to build the private sector. And then once they formulated it, they are now in the policy adoption phase. So by which you mean that you build institutions, you actually give funding. Funding is very important for space capability development. And then you implement the policy. And finally, once you implement it, you need to have a policy evaluation stage in which you see how much money did you spend? Was it effective? Did it promise the returns that it talked about? Did it come back to the society? And that kind of evaluation is very much critical for the space policy process. So in this space policy process, epistemic community, by which I mean academic, activist, those who are invested in space development plays a role, but do not necessarily make the policy. The salience of the issue is very critical. In our book, Scramble for the Skies, which was based on about 5 years of research, including fieldwork in China and India, we basically talked about this entire process of how space policy is adopted and how the whole process actually moves forward in the US, China, India, Luxembourg, and the United Arab Emirates. So now the specifics before I go to China and India. So before we talk about China and India, one of the countries that has the biggest impact on space development is, of course, the US. The US continues to remain the most advanced space nation today, the only country with reusable rocket capability, the ability to launch to low Earth orbit, and then the first booster coming back with the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy, and with Blue Origin's New Shepard. And so what is interesting in the US is that the focus in terms of space policy development is shifting from just space exploration, by which I mean science and technology exploration, to becoming a lot about space development, by which the US argues that space is important for US civilian critical infrastructure, as well as utilization. So the Artemis Accords that the US instituted in 2020 that wants to utilize the resources of the moon is now joined by India as one of the signatory nations. And just this month, Germany also joined in. So they have about 29 nations. So the idea is that you utilize the resources of the moon. And I'll talk about that in China's space program very specifically. And then you have, in the US, you have a cislunar strategy, which is the strategy for the moon. And then finally, they also talk about space diplomacy and development. Now, China's space program that I study in depth is a very interesting space program. So they connect their space program to their grand strategy, by which I mean the larger strategic thinking of a nation, strategic culture, but also regime legitimacy. So the Communist Party of China views space as a very critical component of their regime legitimacy, national security, and economic development. One of the most important things about China's space program is that it has very long-term space goals. So all the achievements that you're seeing today is not thought about yesterday. China instituted its lunar program in 1992, nearly 20 years ago. And what you're seeing today is the benefit of that long-term investment in space. China is the first country to land on the far side of the moon, which is the side that we do not see. And that planning also was about 20 years in the making. And then the other important thing about China's space program is that they fuse their programs. So they have civil, military, commercial fusion, and they do not distinguish between their PLA, the People's Liberation Army, conceived space program, and their commercial civil space program. And that is why it is very difficult for the United States to collaborate with China, because of the fact that they are using space civilian capability for their military space program as well. Now, China's grand strategy in space, most important to maintain access to low Earth orbit. One of the biggest fears of China is that the Strait of Malacca, where China depends on, can be cut off by the US Navy during conflict. And they depend on import of oil, for example, from the Persian Gulf, and they do not want to repeat that in space. China argues that space will be able to return about $10 trillion annually by 2050. And there are great assessments on this. Chinese space scientists have given several interviews explaining what they mean by that. China wants to be able to write the rules of space commerce, becoming the most important actor in space. And then finally, as I mentioned, space is looked at from an economic perspective. So these are some of the missions of China's space program. If you look at their white paper, which they published as a policy paper to protect China's national interests. And key drivers are leadership in space by 2049, the 100th year celebration of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, regime legitimacy, economic development and entrepreneurship, and national security. So one of the chairmen of the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, Wu Yangshang, he gave an interview to CCTV on December 12th last year, and he said that China will have a lunar landing program by 2030, in-orbit servicing, which is the ability to do servicing of satellites in space. No nation has the capability today. So actually, if you can do in-orbit servicing, you can extend the life of a satellite. And then space governance system. So it's very clear they want to focus on such capability. They want to build reusable rockets, and they also want to have long-term presence on the lunar surface. Very importantly, space is about national rejuvenation. Space is a strategic technology, and that space is about leadership and space power. Now, President Xi Jinping is one of the main directors of China's space program, and he argues that it is really critical for the Chinese nation, especially Chinese scientists, to build China into a modern socialist country and to realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And so every industry, including space, and every person should dream and strive courageously and fulfill their dreams. Now, this is where I think some of the strategic concerns from China's space program comes in. So China connects territoriality and resources to first presence benefits. You see this in Tibet. You see this in one of the northeastern states, Arunachal Pradesh, that China claims. You see this in the South China Sea. China argues that if they are somewhere first, that particular territory then belongs to them. And they call it core interests and legitimate interests. So very similar conceptions have been put forward with regard to the moon, where Chinese scientists have argued that if China lands, say, for example, on the South Pole and builds permanent presence for the first time, that is where they will be actually using their first presence benefits claim. So we need to keep that in mind when we think about China's space program. Now, this is where I think the Chinese space program is the most advanced, even more advanced than the US or the Indian space program. So China is investing in a concept called space-based solar power. Space-based solar power is the ability to collect sunlight in space, where it's 24 hours, and beam it back to Earth. Ground solar has many disadvantages. You cannot have the sunlight in the night, there is weather, and you need to have very powerful batteries. And that's why it has not taken over a fossil fuel. So China argues that space-based solar power is one of the strategic technologies that they are looking at. Then they're investing in lunar and asteroid mining capability, and as I mentioned, permanent presence. So this is their space-based solar power roadmap that they put out, the China National Space Administration. So by 2050, they want to achieve a gigawatt level power transmission from geosynchronous orbit. And if China succeeds in doing this, this will be the most advantageous reusable technology that China will have. China also has a very advanced lunar program. They have already demonstrated lunar sample return in 2020. They are the first nation, as I mentioned, to land on the far side of the moon. And then finally, they want to collaborate with Russia to build a space station, a research station on the lunar South Pole by 2036. China is also the first Asian nation to land on Mars surface. India was the first nation to enter Mars orbit. And China is also the first Asian nation to communicate back to Earth because it's very difficult to communicate from Mars because of the huge distance. And these are the pictures that the Tianwen rover sent back. And so China is very proud of the fact that they're able to do this in their first independent attempt. So again, it's a very critical technology that China has in terms of its Mars program. And then Wang Jiazhang, the head of the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, in a presentation that he gave, points out that China wants to have a human mission to Mars by 2037 and to build a Mars base by 2041. So very ambitious, very long-term visions that they have put out and very scientifically developed. So it's a very interesting physics-based program. We have to see whether they can demonstrate the technology, but physics does not limit the capability of humans to get to Mars. Now, they also have a Zhanghe asteroid exploration mission that will fly for a 10-year mission. And they wanted to launch it last year, but now they have shifted the date to 2024 because of COVID issues. And so now they have announced the fact that they will go with Russia to an asteroid for mining purposes as well. China also has a low Earth satellite constellation plan, which is very similar to Starlink, that will have about 12,992 satellites that will build this entire satellite internet for their own communities. And so they want to be a competitor to Starlink. And by 2030, they want to launch about 30,000 satellites. China is the only nation today with an independent permanent space station, the Tiangong space station. We have the International Space Station, but that's a collaborative effort. And so they want to use their space station for several key technology development. One is space-based solar power transmission. Second is to invest whether we can have reproduction in space, which is critical if you want to have human settlement. And they've announced last year that they are going to use this particular space station to build that kind of capability. Now, I already spoke a little bit about China's white paper on space, but some of the things that we need to keep in mind, and this is an official white paper, so it's a space policy paper. They want to develop their space industry. They want to build their reusable heavy lift rockets. They want to build a Belt and Road infrastructure, and then they want to build planetary defense. And if you have questions during the question answer session, I'll be very happy to answer what that means in terms of long-term capability. Now, China views US commercial satellite capability as a military issue. And this particular perspective is important because after the Ukraine conflict, where Starlink was seen as providing communication, navigation, imaging of Russian military envoys, China put up several research papers where they argue that they would have to build counter-space capability, which means anti-satellite weapon capability, laser, blinding, to disable Starlink constellation in case conflict escalates, for example, in Taiwan. China-Russia, as I mentioned, is a very important relationship. And this is the basis of their relationship, the International Lunar Research Station that I mentioned. And this is, of course, put out by the Roscosmos and the China National Space Administration of their lunar research base. China is building the Belt and Road Initiative in space, which is actually counter to India. For example, it includes disputed areas in Gilgit-Baltistan. And today, actually, 2023, they have about 153 member nations that have signed the BRI. Let's go to military space capability, and then I'll move on to India in the about 10 minutes that I have. So if you look at China's military space capability, they have ground-based laser, which means they can blind and disable a satellite, especially an adversary satellite. They've demonstrated a robotic arm, which means they can grab another country's satellite. They are the only country with a quantum satellite that can change the quantum key in case you try to hack it. So they have that experiment up in space. And then they have a nuclear capable hypersonic glide vehicle that can traverse low Earth orbit. China has a very advanced private space sector. People don't realize that actually the Chinese private space sector companies like OneSpace have already launched to orbit. iSpace has already launched to orbit, and then they're building reusable launch capability as well. And so this is something that has happened in the last 5 years or so. Now, India's space program. So India, also very similar to China, connects space to its grand strategy. Strategic culture is increasingly playing a very critical role in India's space program. Drivers are nationalism, a great sense of national pride, international and national development, which means all the technologies that I talked about, agriculture monitoring, weather forecasting, satellite internet. But India has also taken a decision to completely change its manufacturing sector, which was very state-driven. Indian Space Research Organization developed, to making it all private, which is a very critical development this year with India's space policy document. So these are some of India's missions currently, the Chandrayaan program, of which we saw a great success with the Chandrayaan-3 mission that landed near the South Pole of the Moon for the first time for humanity. Yeah, I'm having some issues with the slide here. So these are the missions. So I'll not read it out. You can see it on your screen. India has also launched the Aditya L1 mission this year. That is the mission to go and study the sun's corona. And why L1? Because L1 is the stable area between Earth and sun, where if you put a particular observatory, it remains stable there. And it's pulled and made stable by the gravitational pull of the sun and Earth. And it's such a direct observatory to the sun's corona and to explain the differences in temperature. But more importantly, what it's going to do is that it's going to give us advanced warning of solar flares. Solar flares are dangerous. The Earth's magnetic field saves us today, but there has been incidents, for example, the Carrington event in 1859, where solar flares destroyed telegraph lines. And so the Indian Aditya mission will give us about 18 hours warning if a solar flare is moving towards Earth. Now, what are future missions? So India also has very important future missions coming up. One is, of course, the Lunar Polar Exploration Mission in collaboration with Japan. And I think this is a critical mission because this mission will study and confirm even further the presence of water ice on the lunar South Pole. And they have advanced dates of 2025, 2026 to launch this mission. India also has an India Mars Orbiter mission, the second mission that it wants to go to develop interplanetary mission and scientific exploration. And then India will have the Sukrayan-1 mission that is going to go to Venus and study the atmosphere of Venus. And then I think one of the most critical programs for India is the Gaganyaan mission, which is the mission to send humans to low Earth orbit, especially Indian citizens. And India and the US have signed a strategic partnership this year where they're planning to send Indian astronauts to the International Space Station for the first time next year. So that's a big mission that is coming up for India. India also has military space capability, as I mentioned. India has military satellites that offer satellite data on the disputed border, for example. India has tested an anti-satellite weapon that can destroy another satellite in 2019. India has a separate space force, the Defense Space Agency, as well as a research organization. And then if you look at the tweet that Prime Minister Narendra Modi put out on March 27, 2019, he described Mission Shakti, which is the mission that tested the anti-satellite weapon, as an indigenous effort, but more importantly, it made India a very critical space power with that capability. They did not mention China in their press release, but adversary nation. So it's basically a capability to ensure that Indian satellites are not destroyed, so that India is deterring any counter, for example, from a country like China. Now, I mentioned this already. I don't want to go through this again. India is in a neighborhood that has nuclear weapons, and that makes India's foreign policy and strategic behavior very contingent on that particular neighborhood that it lives. And space, nuclear command and control, strategic warning, space plays the most critical role. Without space, you will be blind if, for example, Pakistan launches a tactical nuke. And so space offers security, safety, as well as reconnaissance if anything goes wrong. And so this is, I want to put this image in front of you. This is a satellite image from Maxar, which is an American private company. And you can see that there were physical installations, for example, on the Indian side of the line of actual control in 2020 that led to the escalation of conflict between India and China and resulted in the death of 20 Indian security personnel and several from the Chinese side as well. And so this is how satellite imaging confirmed that there was intrusion from the Chinese side into the Indian side of the line of actual control. Now, I think this is where I'll end and open up for questions. So I think this is something that the world is absolutely surprised at for India. So as I said, India had a very Indian Space Research Organization led manufactured space program. But this year, India put out a space policy document that actually tells you that the entire process will become private now. India will develop its private space sector. It has developed a New Space India Limited. And more importantly, the Indian Space Research Organization will do research and development, but will not manufacture satellites and rockets moving into the future. it is going to be this particular mapping that India put out. So it will be industry, private industry that will launch vehicle and manufacture satellites. It will be the New Space India Limited, which is a government entity that will give and support this particular structure. And then InSpace will be the one-stop licensing and regulation body that will build into this particular infrastructure. And then, of course, Indian Space Research Organization and the Department of Space will actually collaborate, for example, in terms of what technology to develop and space policy formulation. So India, of course, has a diplomatic space capability. View space is a very critical component. You saw it in Modi's speech, for example, after the Chandrayaan-3 success, that India wants to contribute to global space capability. But also India has concerns, as I mentioned, with China's space capability and territorial aggression, for example, in Ladakh and the South China Sea. India has also taken the strategic decision to build space capability in collaboration with the US, having signed the Artemis Accord and signing the Human Spaceflight Strategic Partnership build-up this year. Now, this is where I think it'll be so interesting to have a conversation in terms of space governance. So when you look at India's space program, of course, there is a big focus on space commerce, grand strategic thinking, space power, space technology capacity. But India differs with the Western discourse on space governance in the United Nations. India has abstained, for example, for US brought efforts to create a moratorium against anti-satellite weapon testing. India has abstained from the open-ended working group that is building responsible behavior in space. And so the Indian argument at the level of the United Nations is that you cannot just limit space governance to norm building, which is not legally binding. Any nation that wants to violate a norm can easily do it because it is not based on a treaty. So what is important is that if you want to have space traffic management, space debris capability, the defunct satellites that can create havoc in space if it hits another satellite, you need to have a treaty that is legally binding at the level of the United Nations. And then India differs in terms of what the focus of space governance should be. Most Western nations talk about responsible behavior. India argues that responsible is a very subjective term. Who defines what is responsible, and behavior can always be subjective. So instead, what you need to focus on is space capability that actually leads to irresponsible behavior. So that's where treaty has to focus on. And then India, of course, views space not just as civilian, but also part of national security space. And then what was interesting from the G20 summit meeting was that India wanted to represent the perspective of the emerging space nation. For example, the African Union joined the G20 summit as a permanent member, and space is a very critical focus of African nations and the African Space Agency that was created this year. And so India wants to have a very important voice in that discourse. And then finally, and I'll end there, space is connected to geopolitics and astropolitics. So thank you for your time, and my 30 minutes is over. And so I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Namrata. This was excellent, and thanks for your deliberation on this very important issue concerning space and how it is India, how it is, centered around India and China. Now I will open the forum for questions from the audience. Before we do that, so let me just share an announcement with our viewers for our next program in a little while, just a second. So our next speaker is Utpal Bora, and our session is coming up. That is on October 8th, 7:30 p.m. India time. And Dr. Bora will be talking about emerging technologies impacting biomedical research. And as many of you know, that he is professor of biosciences and bioengineering at IIT Guwahati. So hope you all will be able to attend. And let us see what questions we have for Namrata. So there is one question from our group, is that how do you compare the space missions of China and India? Is there an unhealthy race to gain power and supremacy? Maybe these two, but whatever you feel, how you might want to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So if you look at China and India's space program, when they first established their space program, there was a common focus on national development, how space can basically develop both nations' capability for uplifting the life of their citizens. So the founder of India's space program, Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, he gave a famous speech where he said that India cannot compete at the level of the Cold War. He was giving a speech in the 1950s, and he pointed out that, but India cannot shy away from not developing space capability because it has such benefits for Indian citizens in terms of, as I mentioned, telling you where monsoons are coming, weather forecasting, disaster response. China also had a very similar narrative. But I think today, if you compare India and China's space program, China has a very different focus than India. So India's space program continues to have traditional goals like satellite launches, showcasing capability to go to geosynchronous orbit and the moon. The focus is more space exploration and space science. So for example, the Chandrayaan-3 mission, most of the mission data that ISRO has put out looks at and confirms the presence of sulfur, for example, has detected elements like iron ore, titanium, platinum. So this is why the moon is so important. So the moon has rare earth minerals like helium-3, which can be used for nuclear fusion, oxygen, water ice, for example, that can be turned to oxygen. Moon doesn't have oxygen by itself, but water ice has hydrogen and oxygen that can be turned into life support if you want to live there, or rocket fuel. And so China basically is different in its perspective. So India still wants to look at the data from a scientific perspective. For China, the argument is that this is about developing permanent presence on the moon. So they are focusing on concepts like lunar resources for building and developing capability on the moon itself. They're looking at extending human settlement on the moon. And so they're focusing on sending their first crewed mission by 2030. And the focus is a lot on space development and space economic capability. So India is still not there in terms of such ambitious program, but is starting to develop a more commercial perspective. Now, in terms of capability, so that is the policy. Now, if you compare capability, China tested its anti-satellite weapon in 2007 and has simulated several other such capabilities since 2007. China established the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, which is their space force, as a completely independent service. India has established a defense space agency, but we are still not clear what the focus of the defense space agency is, and it is under the Indian Air Force. So the space culture, the space concepts are not very clear. And then finally, in terms of capability itself, so India has the medium lift capability, which is the geosynchronous launch vehicle that can lift about 10 tons to low Earth orbit. China's Long March 5 can lift about 25 tons, so much higher scale. That's why they could build their space station, which as the only nation. And then China is developing the Long March 9, which is a heavy lift rocket that can lift about 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit. It's a game-changing technology, and they want to make it reusable, very similar to SpaceX's Starship that Elon Musk is hoping to launch if he gets FCC, Federal Communication Commission's licenses by this year. So there are differences in terms of capability, difference in terms of policy focus, as well as difference in terms of long-term planning for China. China's space programs are planned to 2049, and they have given you very clear plans as to where they want to go: space solar power satellite, asteroid resources, permanent presence, civil military fusion. India's space programs are still, we only know what India is going to do, for example, to about 2026. So it doesn't have that kind of long-term ambition. So there are differences, and on the scale of technology, especially lift capability, China is ahead. But that does not necessarily mean that India may not catch up. India is also trying to develop a heavy lift rocket as well as reusable capability. So we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you so much, Namrata. So there is another question, maybe like everybody might be thinking that for a developing country like India, where there are real problems on the ground, like, and with so much of disparity, economic disparity, and there is, like so much to do for the people economically. So do you think that thinking of space for a country like India is a bit far-fetched and not being realistic, or it's like it is where India should focus? What is your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to ask, because I was asked that question several times on, especially also in regard to Chandrayaan-3 mission, right? So it cost about $75 million. And so the question was that, can India, which has so many other issues, including high levels of poverty, invest in its space program? So my philosophical argument here is that technology advances society. For example, the US investment in a technology like ARPANET, which is the internet that we use, and Vinton Cerf, who I was in a panel with at the UN Science Summit, pointed out that in the beginning, the development of the technology was very expensive and needed US government funding, but then it scaled up. And today, all of us depend on the internet, and has actually opened up knowledge, opened up education, and help people uplift their own lives through e-commerce and businesses, right? So space is a very similar, space contributes to that. So in remote areas, for example, many of my students in Africa sometimes do not have access to good internet. And so we have to actually give lectures by recording on WhatsApp and sending it, and they listen to it, and then they respond back. Today, Nigeria is developing satellite internet, and so the capability is better. So India has similar programs. When I went to some of the remote areas last year in Northeast India, I was cut off from the internet. So despite cell services, so imagine if, and because cell services depend on fiber-based, tower-based internet, when you don't have a tower, the service becomes really bad. So if satellite internet was available, India is also trying to develop satellite internet. Everybody in the remote areas of India would have had very good access to the internet and would have much better capability for doing transactions. So I would say that space also contributes to weather forecasting, disaster management, all kinds of businesses that you want to develop today, a digital economy that almost all nations in the world are focusing on. I think in my philosophical standing, I think building access to space has many spin-off technologies, including in terms of medicine. You'll have a presentation on that very soon. And so it actually contributes to human development. And so today the space industry is about $400 billion. And among that, several emerging nations, including the 55 member nations of the African Union, have taken a decision that without remote sensing, without the ability to have communication that is space-based, they will remain behind. And so today they have taken a decision that they will build space capability by 2063 in their agenda. So for India too, with such a huge population, space actually is a great contributor and will actually help India remove some of the issues it has, including uplifting life. For example, most of us now use banking on our phones. But if you do not have good access to the internet, you cannot actually access it. So a concept like satellite internet will actually help build lives. And I'll finally end with this, that at the UN summit just last week, we had a live Zoom telecast, for example, from tribes in the Amazon. And the reason they were able to do live telecast, and the chief of the tribes he of course was translated for us, but he was saying that the reason he even accepted the 26 disk from Starlink to be able to utilize internet was, first, he said that one of the biggest disasters for Amazonian tribe is that they cannot reach a medical service because they do not have cell service. and people die because they're not able to get to hospitals because they have no communication. So satellite internet is going to enable them. And secondly, he has a huge territory in the Amazon, and satellite internet will help him monitor the territory and defend and prevent violations. So I see space as a big contributor, especially India's space technology and program.
Thank you so much for putting it so nicely. We have one question from one of the attendees, Buljit. So Buljit, do you want to ask the question yourself? Roba, moi tumak unmute kori diba koisu. 1 second. Oh yeah.
Actually, my madam, hi, I am Buljit Bragohai. Actually, my madam, apuni agote code ki pohisle olop jonai dile bhal hobo. Jehetu student hokole etu sabo apuna early education code ki hoisile ekni jate gom pale te student kini olop bhal hobo mon. Etu kane moi apunak koribo bisarisu. Rajdoga jate apuni jonai.
Sure. More education, mostly arts asile. So as was mentioned by Sangamitra and others, I studied in, my schooling was in St. Agnes Convent in Haflong, which is a hill station in Assam. And after I studied, I went to Cotton College for my higher secondary, mostly in economics, political science, history, and logic. And then for my bachelor, I did political science. And then master's in mass communication, political science theory. And then finally, I did a PhD in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and then a postdoc from La Trobe University in Melbourne. And so I would say that people ask me this question, even in the US here, and for students that are listening, space is a very interesting field. You can actually develop capability, for example, in international relations and space policy, and contribute very effectively to education, as well as to space governance at the level of the UN, and also to societal understanding of what space means. Now, for that, the one thing that I realized as I was doing my space policy and international relations project was that you need to have you need to develop an understanding of how the technology works. So for example, you can do that. You can do it. You can teach yourself. You can have conversations. I had very good friends, for example, in NASA that explained to me why the moon is important, where are the resources on the moon, and showed me maps, very clear maps of where the resources are and why nations are looking at a concept like helium-3. And also, I think what I bring, which scientists sometimes do not have, is this geopolitical nation strategic culture perspective, right? So for example, there was a tendency in the United States to say that China does not have advanced space capability, or that China basically takes technology from Soviet Union historically and then Russia. And my argument was that that is not true, because I was looking at their space policy documents, I was looking at their STEM education capability and the technological universities and the generation of space scientists in China. And then the moment they landed on the far side of the moon, everybody was shocked because no other nation had done that before. Russia failed in that far side mission. They did land on the near side, but never on the far side. And then never landed and communicated back successfully from Mars. So what I brought to the table in terms of expertise was this policy knowledge that I had, as well as fieldwork in China to understand where their program is. So I think if you're thinking about a career in international relations and space, if you have a STEM education degree, that's fantastic. You can then contribute to the scientific development of capability like satellites, rockets, communication. You can build abilities like microwave beaming, which is an important technology today. But if you have a background like me, you can teach, you can research on space policy, nations, ambitions, and why they are doing something. And then you'll have to actually do fieldwork in those nations to verify some of the documents and thinking that you have. So that's a little bit of my background.
Thank you again, Namrata. Hangamitra, do you see any questions Can you have a look, please?
I don't. Aru kabar kiba question আছে নেকি? Pawan Sauriya sir.
Hiranyadar eta prashno
Hiranyada.
Hiranyadar to saba neki? Do you want to see? I think
Yeah, Hiranyada আছে যদি Hiranyada নিজে সুধিব
no, I
পাৰে।
think he's not there.
Oh, okay.
I think there is a question which from Pawan.
আছে Pawan Sauriya sir.
Say the question.
Oh, sir.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, actually, I have written the questions. As far as I understood from your talk,
Yeah.
that India are lagging behind China. Okay, so why? This is because of the policy decision or because of manpower, or what is the reason that you think? Or can really India catch up with China? Do you really think that India can catch up with China?
I think the reason why India's space policy investment is different from China is because of policy decisions. So if you look at India's space program, the focus was not so much on military space development, for example, like China had in the beginning, because China's space program is led by the People's Liberation Army. And there is a history for that, because if you remember, Mao Zedong had this great leap forward in Cultural Revolution where space scientists were also purged. And so to save them, people like Deng Xiaoping at the time put the space program under the People's Liberation Army. So they were basically able to secure their lives and not purged. Deng himself lost his son. He was thrown from the 3rd floor of a building. Very, very tragic. So there is a difference in terms of how they view their space programs. So that's one of the reasons where China's space program, India's space program is focused differently, and China's space program is focused differently. So, and secondly, India wants to do smaller missions. For example, the Chandrayaan-3 was much smaller than even the Luna 25 that actually failed with Russia. It was much higher. India's space mission was about 3,900 kilograms. Russia's was about double or triple that size. So why is that? Because India wants to achieve capability by practically showcasing that they can get somewhere with a lower cost. And secondly, India does not have a heavy lift rocket. So because it has lower launch capability, it has to have practical missions that are smaller. Now, the key question is, can India catch up with China? Now, let's look at it institutionally. So India has taken decisions, for example, this year to commercialize its space industry and manufacturing. India is starting to put funding into that. One Indian space startup called Vikram Skyroot has already launched a rocket to low Earth orbit successfully. But having said that, China is far ahead in terms of commercial capability as well. They are building 5G satellite constellation through their commercial capability. They are building a commercial spaceport. They are also able to get to low Earth orbit through their commercial space entities. I think that's because China took the decision much ahead of India in terms of commercialization. Officially 2014, but the thinking went back since US had very good public-private partnership. Secondly, where India is hoping to catch up is a heavy lift capability. As I said, China will have a Long March 9. I don't think India will be able to catch up with the Long March 9 because this capability has been developed in China for the last 10 years. And by 2030, they hope to be able to showcase that India does not have a policy for developing such a heavy lift rocket with 140 metric tons. So maybe India's focus is different and not necessarily catching up to China with regard to heavy lift. Now, in terms of military capability, so civilian, India has lower launch capability, but India has been able to land on the South Pole, near the South Pole, which is again catching up with China, for example, to soft land, which is very difficult, especially the South Pole terrain, because there are a lot of craters. China is going to land their first probe on the South Pole next year, but it will be a much longer mission. So they are planning to have a mission that is going to study the South Pole capability. Where China has more advanced capability vis-a-vis India in regard to the moon is they are able to put their rover, for example, the U-22 rover in sleep mode during lunar night because the temperature is so low, and then they're able to restart it. They have done it for the last 4 years. India's rover, as you know, did not wake up and has not woken up yet. So that ability to survive the lunar night, China has that capability. Military space capability, and I'll end there. So if you look at military space capability, you don't have to be necessarily at par, exactly have the same capability. What you need to have is an ability to counter another nation's satellite capability. So India has that now. They have an anti-satellite weapon. So, and they're able to, they're also, Indian military officers are talking about building laser and blinding capability. Do not have it yet, but we have to wait and see. So China will be careful in targeting India's satellite support capability because India has the ability to counter if China does that. So at least there is some level of deterrence capability, if not very clear capability comparable abilities. And finally, the place where China is again ahead is the thinking behind their People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force. So they see that as a completely independent service, and it has been in the development for the last 7 years. China is the first country to establish a separate space service. India is not there yet. So those are some of the disparities.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sanghamitra, can you see anything else?
Yeah, Namrata, at a question, I think you already answered. It will be the last question.
Yeah.
If students want to pursue career in public policy, geopolitics, space policy, etc., what is the path? I think that you already answered. But what are some of the universities, institution in India they can go to?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the best place to go to is, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru University. They have a very good program on international relations and policy. I would say that my education there gave me the capability to have the kind of knowledge that universities in the US has. So it's comparable in terms of the quality. Another university which is very good is Pune University. They have a very good master's program in public policy. You have Jadavpur University, for example, in West Bengal, that has a very good international relations, specifically focused on international relations. So this is my path and this is my advice. So Cotton College has very good degree program on political science. So if you're able to get into that particular college, that is how my foundation was built. A combination of political science, history is great because it offers you an understanding of nation's historical perspective. For example, I understand India's reticence for space governance because of its history of colonialism. That has a deep impact as well. And so, or African nations, because they also have a great trauma of exploitation, and that history gives you that particular knowledge. So that combination is very good, but you need to specialize. So once you finish a graduate program, be very clear as to which path you want to take. Do you want to teach? Do you want to do just research? For that, you'll need to have a master's. And again, political science is a great way to do that. Pune University had political science with specialization in international relations, so that helped me. And then finally, if you want to go and teach in India, PhD programs, for example, IIT has an arts PhD program as well, very advanced. So I think that's something I would recommend. And then I think I know that Guwahati University also offers very good PhD programs. So you'll have to think. Finally, I will say that one way that I was able to bring forward my research at a global level was a lot of education after finishing my PhD. So a lot of reading, a lot of reaching out to people who have specialized knowledge, because people are very willing to share it if you show interest. And then finally, to also do very specific funding, like Fulbright program was very helpful for me, and the US Institute of Peace Fellowship, because it gave me very specific knowledge in terms of how the policy process works. So, and then finally, if you're looking at international universities. George Washington University has a very good program on public policy. One way to do that is to get funding, and Fulbright offers very good funding and very supportive funding in terms of even finishing a PhD in the US. So Sanghamitra, if I remember, I'll send some of the links to you so that you can share it with the students, but that's the path. It's you have to specialize. And so you come from a graduate program, but then you specialize on public policy and IR.
Thank you so much, Namrata. This is an excellent talk. I mean, I see we have been like, not in touch for a long time, but yeah, our age has increased, but it accelerated in knowledge. So it's like, it's an, extraordinary feeling to listen to your talk and see you like speaking in such an, prestigious media, and we are really fortunate to have you among us. Thank you so much. It's a very informative session. We got some feedback from Facebook, like everybody like said that it's a very informative session. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to hearing you more. Maybe you are telling us that medicine and space that will be coming up. So we are really looking forward to hear your talk like in future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And a real honor to be with you. And Sanghamitra, we should plan to catch up. So let's plan that separately.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
bye, and have a good evening, all of you in India. And bye, Sanghamitra. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you again. And before we conclude, for our viewers, this is our next lecture on October 8th. Our speaker is Utpal Bora. There is a typo here, sorry for that. And he's going to talk on emerging technologies impacting biomedical research. So hope to see you at that time. Thank you again.